It was a cold, windy evening when Officer Daniels made his usual rounds through the quiet streets of the city. The sun had long since set, and the streetlights cast an eerie glow on the pavement. His patrol car hummed as he passed through the downtown area, the sound of tires on wet roads filling the silence of the night. Just as he turned a corner near the bus stop, something unusual caught his eye. A boy, no older than 10 or 11. He was curled up on the cold concrete, asleep on a bench, his face hidden beneath the hood of a worn-out jacket. His small frame was barely noticeable against the bus stop sign, but there was something about him that made Officer Daniels slow his car. He wasn't supposed to be out there, especially not alone at this hour. Concern filled Officer Daniels' chest as he pulled over and stepped out of his car. The boy's body was stiff, and his breathing seemed shallow, as though he had been in that same position for a while. At first glance, it just seemed like another case of a kid staying out too late, maybe running away from home. But as the officer approached, something in his gut told him that this was no ordinary situation. He knelt beside the boy, gently tapping his shoulder. "Hey kid, you okay?" Officer Daniels asked in a soft voice, careful not to startle him. The boy didn't stir. Worried, he shook him a little harder. This time, the boy's eyes fluttered open. They were large, dark, and filled with a mix of confusion and fear. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The officer studied the boy's face, taking in the ragged clothes and the dirt on his cheeks. He could tell the child hadn't had a good night, or a good life, for that matter. "Hey," Officer Daniels said again, his voice firmer this time. "Where are your parents? Why are you out here alone?" The boy hesitated, then sat up slowly, looking around as if he was unsure where he was or how he got there. He wiped his eyes, and the officer noticed how small and fragile he seemed in that moment. I don't have anywhere to go," the boy finally whispered, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Do you need help?" Officer Daniels asked, his heart tightening at the boy's words. The boy didn't answer right away. He just sat there, his legs pulled up to his chest, eyes cast downward. It wasn't until the officer sat beside him, offering a comforting presence, that the boy began to speak again. The words came out in a rush, almost as if he had been holding them back for too long. I'm just trying to get to my mom," the boy said, his voice trembling. "But I don't know where she is anymore. I don't know where to go." Officer Daniels felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just some kid running away from home. There was something deeper here, something that the boy couldn't even begin to explain. The officer took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Where is your mom? Do you have an address?" The boy shook his head. "I don't remember. She left. She told me to wait for her, but I couldn't. I waited and waited, but she never came back." The officer's heart sank as he listened to the boy's story. He wanted to say something comforting, something to make it all better, but the reality of the situation was too much. He looked around the empty streets, wondering what had brought this child here, alone in the dark, with nothing but a thin jacket to keep him warm. "I'm sorry," the officer said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine what you've been through. But I'm here now. You're not alone anymore." The boy's eyes locked onto Officer Daniels, his gaze filled with both relief and fear. He hadn't trusted anyone in a long time, but in that moment, the officer could see that a small part of him believed that maybe, just maybe, someone cared. "I don't want to go back," the boy whispered. "I don't want to go back to that place. It's not safe there." The officer nodded, trying to understand. He could sense that the boy wasn't just talking about a physical place. It was more than that. Something had happened, something that had driven this child to the streets, a place where he didn't belong. "Tell me what happened," Officer Daniels urged gently, trying to get the boy to open up. "Why do you feel like you can't go back?" The boy hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously. He seemed unsure, as if reliving the past was too painful. But after a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared of the dark," the boy admitted, his voice trembling. "I'm scared of what happens when the lights go out. I hear noises, and sometimes I see things that aren't supposed to be there." Officer Daniels' heart skipped a beat. He had heard enough to know that this wasn't just the fear of an overactive imagination. There was something darker at play, something that had terrified this young boy into running away from everything he knew. The officer looked down at the boy, trying to process everything he had just heard. He wanted to promise that everything would be okay, but he knew that wasn't something he could say without knowing the full story. He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, offering what comfort he could. "You're safe now," Officer Daniels said quietly. "We'll figure this out together." But as the boy looked up at him, a flicker of something darker, flashed across his face, and that's when the officer knew there was much more to this story than he had been told, something that would change everything. The boy wasn't just lost, he was running from something far worse than anyone could imagine. And as Officer Daniels looked into those wide, frightened eyes, he knew that his night was far from over. What would he discover about the boy's past? And what kind of dangers lay ahead? The answer to those questions would haunt him long after this encounter. Stay tuned, because this story is just beginning. The wind picked up again, cutting through the empty street, carrying with it the distant hum of city traffic. Officer Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something deep within his gut, telling him this wasn't just another case of a runaway child. The boy's eyes, wide and fearful, seemed to hold secrets that he wasn't ready to share. It was like there was a shadow that hung over him, something unspoken, something that had driven him to this bus stop on a lonely winter night. The officer glanced down at his phone, checking the time. It was well past midnight, and he knew the child should have been safe in bed hours ago. But there was no sign of anyone looking for him. No frantic calls, no missing person reports, just a scared boy, alone on the cold concrete, trying to escape something he couldn't, or wouldn't, name. "Do you want me to take you to a shelter?" Officer Daniels asked softly, trying to offer a solution. "We can find somewhere warm, get you something to eat. You don't have to stay out here." The boy shook his head quickly, his body stiffening at the mention of a shelter. "No," he whispered. "Please, I don't want to go there. I can't." Officer Daniels frowned, sensing the boy's distress. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was a deep, unshakable anxiety. The kind of anxiety that made the boy visibly tremble at the thought of going anywhere but the streets he had come from. "Why not?" The officer pressed gently, his voice steady but concerned. "What happened at the shelter?" The boy hesitated again, his eyes darting around as if he was searching for a way to escape the question. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, he whispered, "There are people there, bad people." His voice cracked, and for a moment, it sounded like he was holding back tears. Officer Daniels could see that he wasn't going to get much more out of the boy right now. Whatever had happened at the shelter, it had scarred him deeply. But the officer's instincts told him there was more to the story, something darker that the boy hadn't yet shared. Trying to keep things calm, Officer Daniels changed the subject. "So, you said you were trying to get to your mom," he asked, hoping to steer the conversation in a direction that might help him understand the boy's situation better. The boy's face immediately softened, a flicker of hope crossing his features before it quickly faded. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, I've been looking for her for a long time. I've been waiting, but she doesn't come back." The officer felt a pang of sympathy, his heart heavy with the weight of the boy's words. Where was she going? Why didn't she come back? The boy looked down at his hands, picking at the frayed edges of his jacket sleeve. His fingers trembled as he spoke again, his voice barely audible. She told me to stay home while she went out. She said she'd be back soon, but she never came back." The boy paused, swallowing hard. That was a long time ago. A cold chill ran through Officer Daniels as he listened. There was something in the boy's tone, something that made it clear he wasn't just talking about a missing parent. There was a weight to his words, a sense of abandonment and fear that went beyond just a lost mother. The officer could sense that whatever had happened, it had torn the boy's world apart. "How long have you been on your own?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice tight with concern. "Months," the boy replied softly. "I've been living in the streets, in the alleys, anywhere I can hide. I don't know where to go anymore. I just want to find her. I have to." Officer Daniels' heart sank. The boy had been alone for months, surviving the harsh realities of the streets. And now he was here, at a bus stop in the middle of the night, with nowhere to go but back to the emptiness that had haunted him for so long. The officer knew he couldn't just let this child slip through his fingers. He couldn't let him go back into the dark alone. "How do you know she's still out there?" Officer Daniels asked gently, trying to piece together the situation. "What makes you think she's still looking for you?" The boy's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I don't know, but I have to believe she's still out there. She promised she'd come back for me." His voice quivered, as if just saying the words brought back painful memories. "I don't want to give up on her." The officer's mind raced as he considered the boy's words. He had to admit, there was something about the situation that didn't quite add up. A mother, promising to return, and then vanishing without a trace. It was a story too familiar to be mere coincidence. Officer Daniels had seen similar cases before, too many times, in fact. But there was something different here, something that didn't sit right. "Do you remember anything about where she went?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice steady but probing. "Anything that could help us find her?" The boy shook his head, his eyes clouded with confusion. "No, she just said she'd be back soon. And I waited, but she didn't come back." The officer sat there for a moment, his mind turning over the details. He wanted to believe the boy, wanted to trust that there was hope in his search. But something about the way he spoke, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder as if he was afraid of something, made Officer Daniels' skin crawl. The boy's fear wasn't just about being alone in the world, it was about something else. Something much darker. Something that he couldn't quite put into words. "I'm going to help you find your mom," Officer Daniels said finally, though his voice held a hint of uncertainty. He wasn't sure how he was going to do it, but he knew he couldn't leave this child to fend for himself any longer. "We'll figure this out together." The boy looked at him, his eyes filled with both relief and something else. A flicker of doubt, maybe. Officer Daniels could see the hope slowly building inside him, even if the boy was still afraid to fully believe it. But just as the officer was about to suggest they go to the nearest precinct to file a report, a sudden sound broke the tension. A low, distant thud echoed through the street, the kind of noise that sent a chill straight to your bones. The boy's head snapped up, his body stiffening as he froze in place. "Did you hear that?" The boy whispered urgently, his eyes wide with fear. Officer Daniels didn't need to ask what the boy was afraid of. He knew. Before the officer could react, a shadow loomed at the edge of the street, barely visible in the dim light, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps grew louder. Someone was coming. Who was it? Was it someone the boy was running from? And what did it mean for their search? The officer's hand instinctively went to his radio, ready for whatever came next. But the boy's panicked eyes told him one thing: they weren't alone anymore. And the story was about to take a turn none of them were ready for. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer with each passing second. Officer Daniels' heart skipped a beat as he stood up, instinctively placing himself between the boy and the shadowy figure that was emerging from the darkness. His hand hovered near his gun, but he held back, knowing that he couldn't make a move until he understood who, or what, was coming toward them. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his small body trembling as he inched closer to the officer. "They're here," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "I told you, they find me everywhere. They never stop looking." The officer's mind raced. Who were they? What was the boy running from, and why was he so sure that someone, or something, was tracking him? Officer Daniels' protective instincts kicked in, but there was a gnawing unease in his stomach that kept him from acting impulsively. This wasn't just a runaway case. There was something much deeper going on here, something darker that he couldn't yet see. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing. The streetlights above cast a faint glow on his face, revealing sharp features, a hard jawline, and a look in his eyes that seemed cold and calculating. Officer Daniels tensed, ready to step in if needed, but the figure didn't make a move toward them. Instead, he stood still, staring directly at the boy. "Is that him?" the officer asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know if the boy even heard him, but he needed to understand what was happening. The boy nodded quickly, his face pale with fear. He didn't know if the boy even heard him, but he needed to understand what was happening. The boy nodded quickly, his face pale with fear. "That's him. One of them," he said, his voice shaking. "They're always looking for me. They want to bring me back." Officer Daniels' eyes narrowed as he studied the man standing in the dark. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, like he wasn't quite human. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone. The officer could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Something wasn't right. The man took a step forward, and the boy flinched, clutching the officer's arm. "Don't let him take me," the boy pleaded, his voice filled with desperation. "Please, I don't want to go back. I can't. You don't understand. He'll hurt me." The officer's mind spun. Hurt him? What did the boy mean by that? Was this some kind of criminal involved in a larger scheme, or was the boy's fear born from something deeper, something more sinister? The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was the kind of smile that sent a shiver down your spine, one that made you feel like prey. "You can't hide forever," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "We'll find you eventually. We always do." The boy trembled harder at his words, pressing himself even closer to Officer Daniels. The officer stood firm, trying to hide the unease that gnawed at him. This situation was quickly spiraling into something far more dangerous than a simple missing child case. "Who are you?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice steady but sharp, trying to assert some control over the situation. "What do you want with this boy?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the officer, his cold eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You don't know what you're getting involved in," the man said, his tone eerily calm. "But it's too late now. You've already made a choice." The officer's grip on his radio tightened. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and the weight of the situation settled heavily on his chest. This wasn't just some random stranger looking for the boy. This was something far more organized and far more dangerous. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just about a missing child. It was about something much bigger, something that was threatening both of their lives. The boy's voice broke through the tension. "Please," he whispered, tears streaming down his face now. "I don't want to go back. I can't. I'm not safe there. They hurt people. I saw it." Officer Daniels' breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. The boy wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket, looking up at the officer with raw fear. They don't care about people like me. They never have. I'm just a tool to them, something they can use. I've seen things, officer, terrible things." The officer leaned closer, trying to understand the gravity of the boy's words. But before he could ask anything more, the man's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Enough, child," he sneered. "You're not going to talk your way out of this. I'm here to bring you back, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." The officer's hand dropped to his side, reaching for his gun. Something inside him snapped, a feeling that whatever this man was, he wasn't going to let him take the boy without a fight. "You're not taking him anywhere," Officer Daniels said firmly, his voice rising in warning. The man's lips twisted into a smirk. Do you really think you can stop me? You have no idea who you're dealing with. The officer's eyes flicked to the boy, whose face was pale and filled with terror. The boy's hands shook as he clutched the officer's sleeve. "Please don't let him take me," he whispered, the desperation in his voice breaking the officer's resolve. "Who are you? What is this all about?" Officer Daniels demanded again, his voice strained but determined. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "You wouldn't understand. You're just a cop, following orders. But the world you live in, it's nothing like the one I come from." His eyes glinted with a strange, unsettling intensity. "And that boy, he's not like you. He's not like anything you've ever seen." The officer's heart raced. The man's cryptic words unsettled him, but what unsettled him more was the boy's reaction. The boy's eyes had widened in shock at the mention of the world I come from, as if hearing it confirmed a long-held fear. The man moved again, stepping closer to the boy. Officer Daniels instinctively stepped forward, positioning himself between them. "Stay away from him," he growled, his voice low and threatening. But the man didn't seem threatened. Instead, he let out a low chuckle. "You really think you can stop me?" he repeated, his voice now dripping with sarcasm. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This child, he's been marked, he's been chosen." Officer Daniels' mind reeled. Chosen, marked. What was this man talking about? Before the officer could respond, the boy spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be chosen." The words hung in the air, the tension thick and heavy as the officer's mind spun in 1,000 directions. What had the boy just said? Chosen for what? And why was this man so intent on dragging him back? But there was no time to process. The shadowy figure reached out, his hand moving toward the boy in a swift, menacing motion. Without thinking, Officer Daniels lunged, grabbing the man's wrist and pulling him back. The man snarled in anger, his body stiffening, and for the first time, the officer saw something unnatural, glowing in his eyes. This wasn't just a man. And this wasn't just a child. The officer realized, with sudden horror, that the truth of this story was far darker than he had ever imagined. The man's hand jerked violently, and for a split second, Officer Daniels felt something strange, an unnatural force, like a surge of energy that threatened to overwhelm him. He tightened his grip on the man's wrist, trying to maintain control, but the force was growing, almost as if it was alive. The officer's breath quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a man. It felt like something else, something far more dangerous. The boy, still clutching the officer's sleeve, trembled in terror. His eyes were wide, flickering with panic, and for the first time, the officer saw just how deep the fear went. This wasn't just a kid scared of being caught. This was something much bigger, much darker. The boy was caught in a battle he couldn't fully understand, one that seemed to stretch far beyond anything Officer Daniels had ever seen. "Get back," the officer shouted, instinctively pushing the boy behind him. But the boy didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the man, and for a moment, it seemed like the world was holding its breath. "Please, stop," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to go back. I don't want to be part of this anymore." His words came out in a frantic rush, as if saying them would somehow break the curse that was slowly wrapping itself around him. The man sneered, a cold, dark smile curling at the corners of his lips. His grip tightened, and the officer could feel it, something otherworldly, as if the very air around them was thick with tension. The officer gritted his teeth, trying to ignore the growing pressure, but it felt like the world was closing in on him, suffocating him. "You can't save him," the man hissed, his voice low and mocking. "He's already part of something much bigger than you. You have no idea what you're dealing with." The officer's mind raced, his thoughts scrambled as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. The man was right. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just about a missing child or some runaway case. There was something hidden in the boy's past, something tied to forces far darker than anything the officer could ever imagine. "Why are you doing this?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice sharp with frustration. "Who are you? What do you want from him?" The man's eyes flashed with a strange intensity, his pupils narrowing into slits. "You don't need to know who I am," he said, his voice growing colder. "But the boy, he's marked, you see. He belongs to us, and we don't like it when our property runs away." The words hit Officer Daniels like a slap. Property? The boy wasn't just a missing child. He was something more, something they claimed as their own. The officer's mind reeled. What kind of people know, what kind of monsters, would treat a child like this? The boy took a trembling step forward, his voice barely audible. "I didn't choose this. I didn't choose any of this." His face was twisted in pain, and it was clear that the weight of whatever he was carrying was almost too much to bear. "I just want to be free." The officer's heart clenched in his chest as he looked at the boy. It was clear now that this wasn't a typical case of abandonment or neglect. This was something far more sinister. The boy wasn't just running from the law, or even from a cruel world. He was running from something much older, something darker than any one person could fathom. Without warning, the man's hand shot out, grabbing the boy by the arm with terrifying speed. The officer lunged forward, but it was too late. The boy gasped in pain as the man's fingers dug into his flesh. "Let him go," Officer Daniels shouted, his voice rising to a shout as he reached for his gun. But even as his hand grasped the weapon, he felt the air around him shift. The man's eyes, those glowing, unnatural eyes, turned toward him, and in that instant, the officer felt a chill crawl up his spine. The world around them seemed to distort, as if the very fabric of reality was starting to unravel. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and for a moment, Officer Daniels felt as if the ground beneath his feet had begun to tremble. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at the officer with disdain, a slow, sinister smile forming on his face. "You have no idea what you're up against," he whispered, his voice almost a growl. "We don't just take what we want. We make what we want. And this boy will never escape." The officer's breath hitched. "Escape from what?" he demanded, stepping closer, his voice filled with growing urgency. "What's going to happen to him?" The man's smile faded, and his expression darkened. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. You can't stop it. No one can. You're too weak to understand." In that moment, the officer realized that this wasn't just a fight for the boy's freedom. This was a battle for his very soul. The boy, still struggling in the man's grip, let out a choked sob. "Please, I don't want to go back," he repeated, his voice breaking with each word. "I just want to be normal. I just want to feel safe." The officer could feel the desperation in the boy's voice, the overwhelming need to break free from whatever twisted hold the man had over him. The officer was running out of time. The tension was building to a breaking point, and if he didn't act soon, it might be too late. In a final burst of instinct, Officer Daniels drew his weapon, but before he could fire, a powerful force slammed into him, knocking him back several feet. His vision blurred as the air seemed to shift again, and he stumbled disoriented. The boy screamed, and the officer's heart lurched in his chest as he saw the man's grip tighten once more. "Enough," the man shouted, his voice booming with authority, and suddenly, everything froze. The temperature seemed to drop in an instant, the air thick with an unnatural cold. The shadows stretched even further, as if they were alive, closing in around them. The officer tried to steady himself, his hands shaking as he gripped his gun. "What do you want with him?" he shouted again, his voice hoarse. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he lifted his hand, and a strange, glowing symbol appeared in the air between them, pulsating with an eerie light. It hovered there for a moment before the man turned his attention back to the boy, his eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't want this. Please," he whispered again, his voice trembling. The officer's heart raced. The tension in the air was so thick, it was suffocating. Everything was building towards something the officer couldn't quite understand, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to stop it. He had to save this boy, no matter the cost. But before he could make his move, the man spoke one final time, his voice laced with cruel certainty. "It's too late, officer. You can't save him." And in that moment, Officer Daniels realized that whatever was happening, whatever force was controlling this situation, was far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. He was out of his depth, and the boy was the key. But the question was he too far gone to save? The words hung in the air, chilling Officer Daniels to his core. "It's too late, officer. You can't save him." The man's voice was like ice, cold and final. But just as the officer opened his mouth to protest, something unexpected happened. A sudden gust of wind swept through the bus stop, scattering papers and debris, and the eerie glow surrounding the strange man began to flicker. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, as if the very world was holding its breath. The officer's grip on his gun tightened, his pulse pounding in his ears. Something was wrong. So wrong that even the air itself seemed to be fighting against it. Then, with a sharp crack, the symbol that had hovered in the air between them exploded into a burst of light, blinding the officer for a split second. He stumbled back, shielding his eyes, and when his vision cleared, the world around him had changed. The shadows were no longer just dark, they seemed to shift and twist, as if they were alive, moving, reaching out toward them like the fingers of some monstrous beast. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that felt foreign and dangerous. And then something unbelievable happened. The boy, the one the officer had been trying to protect, began to glow. At first, it was faint, just a soft shimmer around his body, but as the man's hand tightened around his wrist, the glow intensified. The officer's eyes widened as he saw it for the first time. The boy wasn't just scared. He was asterisk changing asterisk. The same unnatural energy that had surrounded the strange man now seemed to be coursing through the boy, wrapping around him like a cocoon. The officer couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't just fear. This was power. The boy's mouth opened as if to speak, but the words that came out were not his own. They were deeper, darker, and laced with an authority the officer could not understand. "I have waited for this moment," the voice said, echoing through the night. It was a voice that sent a cold shiver down the officer's spine, a voice that didn't belong to a child. The officer's mind raced. He had been focused on protecting the boy, thinking he was just a frightened child, but now it was clear that there was so much more to this than he could have imagined. The boy wasn't just a victim. He was part of something far larger, something far more dangerous. He had been marked, chosen, and whatever this dark force was, it had been waiting for this moment. The man who had been holding the boy in his grip stepped back, his face suddenly filled with uncertainty. "No," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to awaken yet. The officer watched in horror as the boy's transformation continued. His eyes glowed with the same eerie light, and his body began to levitate slightly off the ground, as if the very laws of nature no longer applied to him. The shadows that had been creeping forward seemed to retreat, almost as if they were afraid of the power now radiating from the boy. The officer couldn't understand what was happening, but one thing was certain: the boy wasn't just running from something, he was becoming something. "Get away from him," Officer Daniels shouted, his voice hoarse with a mix of fear and disbelief. He didn't know what else to do. He had no idea how to stop this, how to protect the boy from whatever dark force had taken hold of him. But the man, if he could still be called a man, didn't move. He stood frozen, his face now a mask of frustration and fear. "It's too late," he repeated, but this time there was a hint of desperation in his voice. "You don't understand, do you? He isn't just a child. He's the key, the final piece. He's been chosen to lead them, to lead asterisk us asterisk." The officer's mind raced, but the words didn't make sense. Lead who? Lead what? He glanced back at the boy, whose body was now surrounded by a pulsating light, like some kind of cosmic energy. This wasn't just a child anymore. This was something otherworldly, something beyond anything the officer had ever known. Then, as if to confirm the officer's worst fears, the boy spoke again. But this time, the voice that came from him was not human. It was deep, ancient, full of power. "The time has come," the voice boomed, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. "The awakening is complete." The officer's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just some strange, supernatural event. This was an awakening, a powerful force that had been lying dormant, waiting for this moment to rise. But why? Why was the boy, this frightened, vulnerable child, at the center of it all? The man took a step forward, his eyes wide with something like awe. "Yes," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's finally happening. The boy is ready. The darkness will rise, and nothing will stop it." The officer's mind reeled. He had been trying to protect the boy, thinking he was just some lost kid. But now it was clear. This was no ordinary case. This boy wasn't just a victim. He was the center of something much bigger, a cosmic force that had been waiting to be unleashed. In a frantic attempt to snap out of the daze, Officer Daniels lunged forward, reaching for the boy. But just as his hand was about to touch the boy's shoulder, the energy surrounding him surged, sending a shockwave that threw the officer to the ground. The force was overwhelming, like being struck by 1,000 volts of electricity. He gasped for breath, striving to rise, but as he looked up, everything seemed to shift again. The shadows had grown longer, more oppressive. The air was thick with an almost palpable darkness, as if the world itself was being swallowed by it. And in the midst of it all stood the boy, his body now completely illuminated, glowing with a fierce light that seemed to pierce the very night. But it wasn't a light of hope. It was the light of something ancient, something powerful, something terrifying. The officer's mind scrambled to make sense of it all. What had happened to this boy? And why had it all led to this moment? The boy was no longer the scared child he had once been. He was becoming a vessel for something far beyond human understanding. Then, as if to confirm his deepest fears, the boy's voice rang out again. This time, it was filled with an eerie finality. "You cannot stop this. The darkness is here, and soon you will see what I've become." With those chilling words, the officer felt the world tilt, and for the first time, he truly understood. This wasn't just about saving a boy anymore. This was about surviving whatever was coming next. The boy wasn't just the key, he was the beginning, and the officer was standing right at the epicenter of it all. As the officer struggled to stand, he realized one terrifying truth: the world as he knew it was about to change forever. The world seemed to stand still as Officer Daniels staggered to his feet, his heart racing and his mind a swirl of confusion. The boy, the entity now standing before him, was radiating power, an otherworldly energy that hummed in the air, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Every fiber of the officer's being screamed to run, to get away from this nightmare that had unfolded before him. But his legs felt frozen in place. The boy, no, the thing that had once been a child, spoke again, the voice a strange mixture of innocence and something far darker. "This is the end, officer. You don't understand. I'm not just a victim anymore. I never was. I was chosen. The officer's mind was reeling. This wasn't just a runaway kid in need of help. This was a force, a key figure in something larger, something ancient, something terrifying. And yet, despite the dark, chilling presence radiating from the boy, there was a part of Officer Daniels that couldn't let go of the empathy he had once felt for him. There had to be a way to help. There had to be a way to save him even now. Taking a step forward, his voice trembling but determined, the officer called out, "You're not just some weapon. You're more than this. You're a person. You don't have to do this." For the briefest moment, the boy's eyes flickered, just a flash of vulnerability, of confusion, before the glowing energy around him flared up once more. But it wasn't the boy anymore who controlled the power. It was something else. A darker force had taken hold. The air thickened with pressure, and Officer Daniels could feel his chest tightening, as if the weight of the boy's transformation was crushing him. He could hardly breathe, but he didn't let up. He wasn't going to give up on the boy, not now, not when he was so close to the truth. Suddenly, the man who had been watching this unfold, standing silent all this time, spoke once more. "You think you can stop this?" His voice was laced with derision, but there was a slight tremor in his words. "You think you can save him? He's *ours*, and there's nothing you can do." With a strange, almost resigned look, he raised his hand to the sky, and the darkness around them seemed to pulse with energy. It was as if he was calling something from the very depths of the earth, something old and terrifying. The officer's eyes widened as he saw a swirling, shadowy mass begin to form above them, thick and alive, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The boy, now fully enveloped in a swirling cocoon of light and shadow, let out a scream, one that was both anguished and filled with rage. The energy around him began to crackle violently, and it seemed like the world itself might shatter at any moment. "I don't want this," the boy cried out, his voice breaking through the dark force that was consuming him. "I never asked for this." And then something incredible happened. The officer, driven by a surge of hope and desperation, reached out with every ounce of strength he had left. "Fight it, kid," he shouted, the words coming out in a strained, desperate plea. "You can still make your own choice. Don't let them control you." In that moment, everything seemed to go silent. The glowing energy surrounding the boy flickered, and the swirling shadows above them stilled. For the first time, the boy's eyes, no longer glowing with that unnatural light, met the officer's gaze. "Help me," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible, a raw cry of helplessness that shattered the officer's heart. But before he could reach out, before he could do anything to stop it, the man moved faster than the officer could react. With a swift motion, he raised his hand and uttered a single word. *Enough*. The ground shook with a deafening roar, and the boy's body contorted in pain, the light around him flaring one final time before bursting into a blinding explosion. The officer instinctively shielded his eyes, and when the light finally faded, the boy was gone. A heavy silence fell over the scene. Officer Daniels stumbled forward, panic rising in his chest as he looked around. But the boy, whatever he had become, was nowhere to be seen. The man, too, had disappeared, vanishing into the shadows like a ghost, leaving the officer standing alone in the empty bus stop, the remnants of the terrible energy still lingering in the air. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. What had just happened? Had he lost him? Was the boy forever gone, consumed by the forces that had taken hold of him? And then, as if in answer to his unspoken question, the officer heard something, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the direction of the shadows. "I'm still here." The officer spun around, his heart racing again as he looked toward the voice. From the darkness, the boy, no, the child emerged, his form now fully visible. But this was not the same boy who had been standing before him earlier. He looked different, changed, but not in the way the officer had feared. His eyes were clear, no longer glowing with that unsettling light. There was no aura of dark power around him. He was, in fact, more himself than ever before. The boy looked up at the officer, his face soft with a sadness that struck the officer to his core. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," the boy said, his voice trembling. I just wanted to be normal." A mix of relief and sorrow flooded through the officer. He couldn't explain what had just happened, but he could see now that the boy had won. He had fought back the darkness that had threatened to consume him. He was still here, and that was all that mattered. The officer took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You're free," he said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "You fought it. You're not alone anymore." The boy nodded, though there was a look of deep sorrow in his eyes. "But I can't go back to the way things were. Not after all of this." His voice cracked. "I'm not just a normal kid anymore." The officer reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, "a promise. You're not alone in this, okay? We'll make sure you're safe." And just when the officer thought they had found a moment of peace, something else shifted, something he hadn't anticipated. The boy's gaze darkened for a brief moment, his face twisted with a mixture of confusion and fear. But he hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the horizon. What if they come back? The officer's heart skipped a beat, his senses sharpening once more. Something was stirring, something the boy hadn't fully understood yet. "Who's coming?" the officer asked, his voice taut with growing dread. The boy swallowed hard, his eyes haunted. "They aren't done with me. Asterisk, it's only just begun, asterisk." With that chilling revelation, the officer felt a cold wave wash over him. The fight for the boy's soul wasn't over. Not yet. The officer stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the boy's words sinking in. "It's only just begun." The phrase echoed in his mind, sending a shiver down his spine. He had thought that the worst was over. He had believed that the boy, having fought back the dark force that had tried to consume him, was finally free. But now the officer was faced with a new reality, one that was more terrifying than anything he had imagined. "Who's coming?" he asked again, his voice hoarse. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not out of danger. Whatever had brought this darkness to the boy's life wasn't finished yet. The boy's face was pale, his features etched with fear. He glanced around nervously, as though expecting something to appear from the shadows at any moment. "I don't know," he whispered, shaking his head. "But I can feel them. I can feel them getting closer. They'll be back for me, for us." The officer's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't understand everything the boy was saying, but he understood one thing: the fight was far from over. He had been so focused on saving the boy that he hadn't even considered what might come next. But now, standing there with the boy, he realized that they were both facing something far larger than either of them could have anticipated. "You're not alone," the officer said, his voice firm, his resolve growing stronger with each word. "I won't let them take you. I'll protect you." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with doubt. "But how?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if they're too strong? What if I can't fight them off again?" The officer knelt down to his level, trying to meet his gaze. "You don't have to fight alone anymore. We'll figure this out together. Whatever's coming for you, we'll face it. You're not just a kid anymore. You've got power, strength inside of you. I saw it." For a moment, there was silence. The boy's eyes searched the officer's face, looking for any sign of hope, any glimmer of reassurance. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, the officer saw a flicker of something in the boy's eyes, something like belief. The boy nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "Okay," he whispered, "I'll trust you. But I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting. This is bigger than me." The officer stood, taking a deep breath himself. He had no idea what was really going on. He didn't understand what kind of force they were dealing with, or why the boy had been chosen as its vessel. But what he did understand was that he wasn't going to leave this kid to face it alone. Not again. As the officer looked around, a sense of urgency washed over him. They needed to get to safety, to somewhere the boy could regroup and prepare for whatever was coming. He looked at the boy, who seemed exhausted, drained from the battle within himself, the transformation, and everything that had unfolded in the past few hours. "Come on," the officer said, his tone softer now. "We need to move. We need to get you somewhere safe, away from all this." He gestured toward the shadows, the remnants of the dark energy still lingering in the air like a silent threat. "We can't stay here." The boy nodded, his face pale but resolute. As they moved, the officer kept a watchful eye on their surroundings. The feeling of something looming in the distance, something that hadn't gone away, still clung to him. Every rustling of the leaves, every creak of a distant branch sent a wave of unease through him. He wasn't sure if they were being followed, or if the danger was still out there somewhere, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let his guard down. Not now. They walked in silence for a while, the tension thick between them. The officer could feel the weight of everything that had happened, the mysteries that had yet to be unraveled. What had the boy been marked for? Who, or what was after him? And how had it all started in the first place? They reached a small, quiet park at the edge of town, the distant glow of streetlights flickering in the cool night air. The officer led the boy to a bench, motioning for him to sit down. He knew they needed a plan, something to give them a fighting chance. But for the moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to let the stillness of the park ground him. "I don't know what's happening, kid," the officer said, sitting next to him. "I don't know how any of this works, but I do know this, we'll figure it out. You're not alone in this. We'll protect you." The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide. "You really mean that?" "I do," the officer replied firmly, nodding. "No one should have to go through something like this by themselves. We'll find out what's going on. We'll stop whoever, or whatever, is after you." But as he said those words, the officer felt a cold sensation creeping up his spine. Something was wrong. A chill had settled in the air, and the shadows around them seemed to grow darker. He glanced up at the sky, but it wasn't just the darkness that unsettled him. It was the way the stars seemed to flicker, like distant lights that were slowly fading. And then, in the silence of the night, he heard something, a faint whisper, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere. "We are always watching." The officer's heart skipped a beat. His hand instinctively went to his gun, his body tensing, ready for whatever might come next. The boy beside him looked terrified, his eyes wide, searching the darkness for the source of the voice. "What was that?" the boy whispered. The officer didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what to say. He had thought they were safe, but now he wasn't so sure. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But I don't think this is over. Whatever is coming for you, it's not just going to go away." The boy nodded, his face pale but determined. "I'm ready. We'll face it together. You're right, officer. I don't have to do this alone." As the officer looked into the boy's eyes, he realized something. They weren't just facing an external enemy. They were facing something that had taken root deep within the boy. Whatever had marked him, whatever force had chosen him, had done so for a reason. But now the boy had a choice. He could embrace the power that had been given to him, or he could fight it. And with the officer by his side, maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to defeat whatever darkness lay ahead. The officer took a deep breath, looking out into the night. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he believed they might have a chance. Whatever was coming, they would face it, together. And no matter what, they would fight, because the boy had already proven that he could. The officer just needed to make sure he didn't have to do it alone.